very strange enchanting boy. They say he wandered very far over land and sea. A little shy and sort of right, but very wise was he. And then one day, a magic day, he passed my way, and while we spoke of many things, fools and kings, this he said to me: the greatest thing you'd ever learn is just to love and be loved in return. Then one day, a magic day, he passed my way, and while we spoke of many things, fools and kings, this he said to me: greatest thing you ever heard is just to love and be loved in return.
Hello and welcome to Blasphemous Weekender 2020. My name's Anita Shervington and I'm the director of Blasphemous and I'm the host for today. And I'm joined by my co-host, Ju Salim, who is an artist and also the head of Afroflux, which he can tell you a bit more about now.
Well, we're not here to talk about Afroflux right now because we're at the Blasphemous right now. I want to say thank you to Anita Shervington for having me here. You've been listening to the sounds of Jazz 5, and on double bass we have Ray Grant.
And on the drums we have Jeff Blake.
Guitar, Ralph DeCamp.
And on the keyboard, we have Andy Pete.
Break it down. A day.
Thank you. I'm sure everybody's clapping at home. Excellent. Thank you. Did we
Got
mention everybody? Did we mention everyone?
Did we mention everybody?
I don't think we mentioned
That was a bit staggered.
Trevor Huggins on saxophone. But thank you,
We did
everyone.
mention him. We did mention him.
So let me tell you a little bit about Blastfest. Blast is a pop-up festival platform that fuses the creative power of science with black arts and culture, and we use that to make change in our communities. We normally pop up at Caribbean carnivals, museums, community centres, and other cultural events to engage the public with science in culturally responsive ways. Now, this year, we've all been impacted by COVID-19, so some of our summer program had to be cancelled. But this weekend, we're fusing a few events together, our main events, into one festival weekend. So we've got the Wilson Shervington Memorial Lecture. We've got Sound as a Weapon for Change later on today. And then tomorrow, we've got Black Steam, which is our annual showcase that focuses on Black brilliance in science,
In the evening.
social justice, culture, and creativity.
And if you aren't already here, you can follow our Blastfest UK. That's on Insta. For Twitter, it's Blastfest UK. And on email, it's info@blastfestuk. Just in case you're not already here or you want to pass on the information. And later on, we'll be having various different Q&As, so you can get questions over to us via those different @s.
So this is our first online event. So apologies for the technical problems and the delays. So we are just over an hour late as well. So teething problems, but we're getting there. We want to say a special thank you to the Royal Academy of Engineering, who have funded us this year through an ingenious grant. So thank you to you. And thank you to all of our contributors. So I just want to mention that Vic, we're really pleased to have Vic. Vic was actually my dad's friend. And our next event that we're going to move on to now is the Wilson Shervington Annual Lecture. Wilson Shervington was my dad. He was a man who believed in education for liberation, and there's nothing that he enjoyed more than listening to jazz and a political debate. And so that's the nature of our next speaker. Well, we have the jazz here, but now we have the political debate.
All right. This year's lecture will be given by Oliver Hypolite-Bishop, the coolest political commentator in the UK. Thank you for that one. He studied politics in both the UK and US, where he was also an American football player. Oliver's specialisms focus on race, racism, class, and inequality within Britain. In addition to many other things, he's the founder and chair of the London Spirit Awards that recognizes young people for their talents in the arts, media, sports, campaigning, and education. The title of this talk is The British Civil Rights Story.
However, I'm honored to be here today. I guess when I first put out the message at the beginning of Black History Month that I wanted to do some talks for the month, because I felt like it was an important movement that I wanted to contribute to. I didn't expect to get all the feedback that I did and all the responses, and I was very privileged to be able to speak at many different organisations, from the British Transport Police to various different organisations and charities. But when you and I first spoke, Anita, and we spoke about your idea for this event and the reason why you're doing it, and the links between your father and the Caribbean, the Black diaspora, it made me think of my own relations with Black politics in the Caribbean. And we kind of clicked on that. We had a call that was supposed to be for 5 minutes, and it ended up going on for an hour. So I knew that this is something that I wanted to be a part of. So I'm very appreciative and honored that I can be a part of this. And just to talk about what we're going to cover today, before we go into anything, I always want to talk about house rules, because the kind of conversations we're going to get into, which is about Black politics, activism, are sometimes very difficult ones to have. And I know that a lot of the time, a lot of the challenges around these conversations is that people feel uncomfortable in terms of terminology or how you address and talk about these issues. So essentially, I mean, the spoiler's there in the slide, right? There are no rules to this conversation. If you have things you want to ask me, and if you're going to have a moment for Q&A at the end, feel free to ask these questions. At the end of the day, I can honestly say I do not try and pretend that I hold any monopoly of knowledge on this conversation. I'm just a guy with opinions and thoughts and passions, and that's what I try to bring to these conversations, but I don't pretend to be the bastion of knowledge that dictates what is right and what is wrong. But okay, nonetheless, so what are we going to talk about today as part of this fantastic event and as part of this lecture? I want to talk to you about, I guess, what I regard as the continuity of Black protest and of Black activism throughout the past century and its impact on not just our lives, but on terms of policy and our political landscape and that contribution. The reason why I think this is a very important topic for us to have at this moment is because we, as a country, we seem to be so comfortable as we look across the shore to what happens in America with George Floyd and what happened over the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests, and understand it so viscerally and so vividly, the pain that African Americans feel. But when those movements come to the UK, it's often so difficult for us to understand. And I say us, I mean, I think a lot of us within the Black community may understand this, but in wider society, to understand exactly what the issues are within the UK. And it almost makes Black Lives Matter feel like a random moment in time, as opposed to a part of a thread of a long, continuous struggle for equity from the Black community and what that has contributed to our politics and society. So I want to talk about that. But I'm going to start talking about me first, not because I'm any particular narcissist, but I think it's important to in order to add some color to the conversation, you know, who's the guy that's talking to you. I also want to talk about Britain's particular issues with race and why I think that is. Spoiler alert, I think a lot of it has to do with colonialism. Then I want to talk about where I think, I say we, but I mean more so the Black civil rights movement is what I've come to call it, as opposed to just Black Lives Matter, but it's a movement that longs through it, where I think we are now and where it needs to go. And then I'll have some closing remarks and hopefully we have some time for Q&A. So yeah, so let's get into that. But let's first, I want to start talking about me. Also, my notes are over here, so I'm not just ignoring everyone, I'm looking to my notes. So I always felt like my economics teacher at school had an issue with the Black and brown boys in his class. He was a white, middle-aged man, pained by a chokehold of unfulfilled dreams. He would use his class to quiz the young Black boys on the troubles in the local area, blessing us with unwanted analyses on the links between Black boys and crime in Camden, removed from any data or evidence that we would foolishly expect from an economist. So one afternoon, tired of having to sit through another class of uncomfortable conversations with my teacher, I just blurted out, "You're a racist, innit, sir?" To which he responded, Now, Oliver, we're just having a chat. Don't play the race card, son." Initially, the idea of a race card to a 16-year-old boy was actually quite appealing. So you mean to say for as long as I remain Black, I could say these magic words, "You're racist," and that would get me out of any argument. But in truth, at 16, I was too young to fully comprehend or to articulate what had happened in that moment. That my rightful criticism of being told that people like me were bad simply because they were Black was merely a conscious ploy to use racism to my advantage and to manipulate this poor middle-aged man into feeling bad about himself. That I wasn't broke or a daily target of my local police due to the circumstances of the environment I was born into, but that all of us Black people had met up one day to develop a secret race card conspiracy to make white people feel awful whenever we felt like it. The words brought me back to when I was first stopped and searched. I was around 13 or 14, and I handed a friend 50p to get me a Mars bar at the shop, and I was met by a van of police who rushed over like I was El Chapo. They lined us up, removed the shoes from my feet, pulled down my trousers, ripped off my hat, and as they searched, they took the Walkman off my hip. to laugh and make jokes at the rap music I was listening to. And so in front of my neighbors, local shopkeeper and friends, I was accused of selling drugs. So back in that classroom while I sat berated by my teacher on societal issues beyond either of our comprehension, accused of playing this race card, I thought, you know, if only I had that damn thing every time I was stopped by the police, every time the bus drove past us and refused to pick us up, every time we would try and get a black cab, every time I was followed through the supermarket, every time we had to run for the National Front. Why wasn't this damn race card working? This thing must be busted. But I guess in many ways I was the perfect target for my teacher. While I only ever had decent grades, I wasn't the most innocent of kids. I found myself, like many young, poor kids in London, lost in a violent world that took you in like family, but deep down you always knew it wasn't a home you'd survive long in. Teachers back then didn't really know what to do with kids like us. We were smart, but naughty. The same friend that handed me that 50p was also a smart kid in school, but was dropped from the top set, where he could get up to an A star, went to the third set, where the highest grade he could attain was a C. And I couldn't work out why being a bit loud translated into your grades, particularly when I saw other kids playing class clown, knowing they had private tutors at home. And so I knew what I was seeing in my life was messed up, but I didn't yet possess the language and confidence to counteract the diction of racism with my own. So I just sat there and I witnessed it. So I guess I wanted to kick off by telling this story, because I always think back to these moments as defining ones for me. And of course, it's going to shape our conversation today, but also I think the best way to tell you about me is to tell you a story, rather than just run off the regular credentials, you know, I did X, Y, Z, worked here and there. So that frustration I felt as a boy, of not wanting to fall victim to my environment, of not wanting to accept the inequality and prejudice that was increasingly becoming a part of my life, for not wanting to be defined by any one thing, whether it's criminal or it's black, I chose to fight this thing called racism. And I knew that if I was going to do so successfully, it would require me to understand not only the language and mechanics of racism, but to understand language itself, to understand politics, sociology, business, and history. So I went to uni, I did all of that. I studied politics and history. I learned to write, learned to debate calmly, to network. And when I finished, like most students, I couldn't get a job. And I ended up desperately tweeting this senior civil servant who was running for mayor at the time. But in the end, it turned out to be one of the best decisions I ever made, because she gave me a chance. She disregarded my very empty CV at that point and instead judged me on my ambitions. And by the end of the campaign, I was running it. Siobhan was the independent candidate running for mayor of London in 2012. So she had no money to give me. Throughout the campaign, I would sofa surf, each day wearing the same, by this point, pretty well-worn Marks and Sparks suit that my mum's husband had bought for me. And although we, of course, did not win that race, we ended with the best ever result for an independent candidate running for mayor of London. So from there, I went into policy, holding senior lobbying roles at the Confederation of British Industry, and then into digital products, where I currently work with BT, helping them to build digital products with a societal purpose. I've given evidence to parliamentary commissions on serious youth violence, lobbied prime ministers and sat on boards, and helped to found charities and campaigned fighting for racial and social justice. I guess all the things that once felt so foreign to the young boy from Camden. So I want to start with that story just because I thought it was important to give some flavour about, I guess, who I am, who is this guy giving you this lecture. Anita, very, very lovely. She called me the coolest political and social commentator in the game, and I'm trying to take that on board. But yes, now I want to talk to you about what I mentioned earlier. It's about this thread of activism and protest throughout our history, and it's why I think it doesn't exist in our narrative, but why it's so vital to who we are and to building a national identity based on our history. So I want to start telling you a story, the story of a young, talented, Kingston-born herbalist. Not that one. His name was Dr. Harold Moody. Howard was the son of a pharmacist, and in 1904, he traveled to London to study medicine at King's College. There, at 28, he graduated medical school at the top of his class. And being such a cliche prodigy, many would expect in today's world that the job opportunities will come flooding in. But in the UK, there had been a long-standing arrangement by employers to refuse black people jobs in many industries. Undeterred by the reality of being black in the motherland, Dr. Moody set up shop in Peckham. And over the next 20 years, he will become a revered name in the growing black British community. While Moody was fortunate enough to build a life for himself in Peckham, the country itself was in trouble. Britain was a country emerging from the First World War, and so there were labour shortages and shrinking industries, particularly in the port towns of Cardiff and Liverpool. And so white working class union workers, stoked by social, economic and political anxieties of the time, took aim at the growing black population of seamen that had just fought for the country in the First World War. In 1919, what we seem to call race riots today erupted across the seaport areas of Liverpool, Cardiff and Salford, but also in London. White union workers lashed out against any worker and business that wasn't white, and in the process lynched a young seaman named Charles Wootton. His death is still a stain on Liverpool to this day. Moody witnessed the plight of black people in Britain who were unable to get jobs whilst also being blamed for labour shortages. He witnessed the government try to resolve the tension by repatriating, aka deporting, as many black people as possible. Even the shipping companies that did hire black labourers were encouraged by the government to then fire them. The rioting would last for 3 years, leaving black people in the seaport towns and across the country essentially destitute. So the doctor got active. Eventually in 1931, he established a League of Coloured Peoples, whose undertaking was to bring together the various British communities of colour to contest this so-called colour bar. The colour bar was the long-standing series of principles and policies and informal practices used to prevent black people from working on key industries like the railways and buses, for example. And this wasn't just any group, however. Within its membership was the likes of Una Marson, the Jamaican poet, Paul Robeson, the American star athlete and concert artist, Jomo Kenyatta, who would become the anti-colonial Prime Minister of Kenya in the 1960s, C.L.R. James, the British Trinidadian and author of the Black Jacobins, great book. It was essentially, this was the NAACP of the UK. And through the League, Moody fought for causes including employment rights for black merchant seamen, fair pay for Trinidadian oil workers, and the lifting of the implicit colour bar in the British Armed Forces that was still preventing the appointment of black officers. Moody overturned the Special Restriction Order, aka the Coloured Seamen's Act, that's the real name, of 1925, a discriminatory measure that sought to provide subsidies to merchant shipping, employing only British nationals, and required alien seamen, many of whom had fought in the First World War, to register with their local police. Dr. Moody was eventually appointed to a government advisory committee on the welfare of non-Europeans, but in 1943 he had died, and this was 1 year before the Windrush. The colour bar was at this point breaking, but still very much intact. It wasn't until 1963 when a young social worker by the name of Paul Stevenson, inspired by the civil rights movement that was happening in the US, took up Dr. Moody's mission to fight the colour bar by organising the Bristol bus boycotts and sit-ins across public houses. And it was through this action that the colour bar was finally ended in principle. 2 years after the boycotts, with the passing of the 1965 Race Relations Act, Stevenson's campaign became enshrined in law, a testament to over 60 years of campaigning and a fitting tribute to the life of the Kingston-born doctor. In 1966, Asquith Xavier fought the continuing colour bar on the British Railways, forcing them to drop their discriminatory practices. 2 years later again, the 1968 Race Relations Act pushed us even further. And so I tell you this story, not, I hope, to bore you with a history lesson or to lecture you on how great black people are, because we don't need romanticized stories. We just need a whole one. History for me is about the present and the future as much as it is about the past. And importantly, history is a tool to which we can unify and build a more cohesive and fuller British identity. And so we need these stories. We need all the contributors of Britain's story to be told. Because this, unlike what some beer-chugging so-called patriots told me outside Westminster, and this is a true story, in fact, if you look in this slide, me and my mate were cycling through, I was on my way to Hampstead Heath, and we're cycling past Westminster. I didn't know it was the day of the, quote-unquote counter-protesters, and these guys just bombarded me with all of their opinions and thoughts. Not one of them made sense. And so it's unlike what these particular types of individuals told me. This is not about black people hating Britain or wanting to erase our history. We are not involved in any culture war being waged by middle-class white men. We don't want white people to hate Churchill or to never mention empire again. We don't really care about the prompts. We simply want all of our inclusive stories, like the one I told you, to become part of Britain's story. Because Britain's history is not just about what we did when we crossed the oceans, but also of the lives of the people they met and how their histories were shaped by it. It's an international story. As the late Siv Nandan said, we are here because you were there. And so it's important that we take the inclusive, painfully honest and real version of our history, because history is a vital ingredient for social justice. And so if we stick to the script, a predominantly white, straight, male script, we lose all that makes us who we are. And our history only serves to divide us rather than to bring us together. Divide us like a prime minister who calls Black Lives Matter protesters thugs while simultaneously tweeting out 8 tweets defending Winston Churchill, a man who hated the very air Black people breathed. That's a quote. So while you don't need to hate Churchill, we ask that you simply understand him, because Churchill's story, Beyond War, is one of entrenching racism within Britain. And through Churchill's story, we learn of other Black civil rights heroes that worked to defy him. In the decades that Dr. Moody was fighting to end the colour bar, Len Johnson, one of the greatest boxers in British and Mancunian history, was also embarking on his own civil rights journey as he fought to end the colour bar in British sports. The colour bar was being reinforced by no other than Winston Churchill, who in 1911, as Home Secretary, fueled by the ideologies of eugenics, banned interracial boxing matches. It stopped Johnson fighting for the British title, earning him the title of being the uncrowned champion. Johnson retired from boxing in 1931 with a record of 95 wins, with 26 knockouts, and chose to become a fireman instead. But in 1946, Johnson set up the New International Club with 2 of his white friends. The club would provide support to the growing Black community in South Manchester, now the infamous Moss Side. And when a Manchester shipping company sacked all of its Black workers, it was Johnson and his team at the New International Club that galvanized the community of Black and white workers to force the shipping company to reverse their decision. Johnson was our very own incredible civil rights athlete. One time, Mike Tyson actually described him as one of the greatest fighters to come out of Britain. Well, we must think of him too as our version of our Ali, as one of the greatest advocates for civil rights through sport. And so I wanted to demonstrate the thread throughout our history of Black British activism and participation in our politics and policy, which has only strengthened and improved our society. It's why we can't look at Black Lives Matter as simply a moment in time, but instead the continuation of a long struggle for equity. Similarly, this story to me demonstrates the repetition of the same racial and anti-immigrant stereotyping, scapegoating, discrimination, and criminalization that we still see happening today. In all my research, there has not been a decade in modern Britain without a significant civil rights moment or a white backlash against ethnic minorities. For example, in the 50s and 60s, beyond the colour bar, Teddy Boys rioted and attacked Black people with impunity. This was a response to the Windrush rivals. In the 70s and 80s, there was intense racial violence from the National Front and other far-right groups. The New Cross arson attack that killed 14 Black kids aged 14 to 22. There was police brutality on an almost totalitarian scale. Thatcher's sus laws, the precursor to stop and search, aided by media hysteria, turned young, vulnerable Black boys into pathological violent criminals. And the political invention of the Black mugger, which mutated into the myth of Black on Black crime, gave police the authority to do almost whatever they wished to apprehend them, even when there was no crime being committed. In the 1990s, things reached an almost boiling point when young Stephen Lawrence was brutally murdered by right-wing fanatics. The 90s saw continuing protests and riots as people called for this basic civil liberties and equality of opportunity. It's the same things they had cried out for in the decades previous, and the same things that we call out for today as we march. These are the cries of a broken community that continue to fall on deaf and indifferent ears. Yet, each decade is also defined by activism and resistance, from British people of all colours refusing to accept this status quo, much like what we see today. Just a few examples: in the 70s, the Black British Panthers emerged to protect Black neighbourhoods from increasing police brutality and far-right groups. In 1979, Olive Morris campaigned against the use of Depo-Provera, an attempt to sterilise poor Black women without their knowledge. In the early 80s, the National Black People's Day of Action drew a crowd of 20,000 people to protest against the New Cross fire. In the 90s, Doreen Lawrence fought tooth and nail for justice for her son. which culminated in the McPherson Report, which helped to detail institutional racism that many Black people had to endure. Britain is stronger for its history of Black activism. It's challenged us to do better, but we are constantly weakened by our inability to acknowledge the thread throughout. I guess I could go on, but hopefully the point is made, that today Britain remains detached from history. And because of this, we continue to normalize the policing of Blackness, from policing Black neighborhoods, Black music, and Black culture, all direct links to a history of societal oppression that's been neatly swept under the rug. And I suppose this leads me to another question. Have you ever asked yourself why you know of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X so well, of Nelson Mandela, of Muhammad Ali and Angela Davis, but we know nothing of Dr. Moody, or Paul Stevenson, Frank Critchlow, or Darcus Howe? Why do we know of Enoch Powell and Oswald Mosley, but not of Ansel Wong, Selma James, Claudia Jones, Olive Morris? Why do we know George Floyd, but not Jerry Gross, or Cynthia Jarrett, Sean Rigg? What is it about this history of British racism, segregation, and activism that is so hard to acknowledge, while we can so easily cast judging eyes across the ocean to our American neighbors? And for me, and I've alluded this to a number of times now, I think, but I believe it's because the kind of stories I've told you so far of Black protests against constant racism and prejudice run entirely counter to the story of post-colonial Britain that we as a country have chosen to tell. Instead of this wider story of modern Britain, of a struggle for progress, the UK's relationship with the topic remains muddled in these truly crazy and wild paradoxes. We attach proud, liberal values to a racially oppressive history. We love our empire, but somehow equally hate racism. We know this because 44% of people in the UK still say they are proud of Britain's history of colonialism. That, to me, says you don't know much about Britain's history of colonialism. We pride ourselves in abolishing slavery, but somehow forget to mention our role in its inception. We clap for the NHS, but simultaneously try to deport the people we invited to build it. The Windrush generation was used as a symbol of our multicultural principles, but we swiftly removed their freedoms to codify British citizenship. At this point, it's almost unpatriotic to be honest about our history. And so the horror stories of racism across the world and in the Americas are used to almost reinforce our assessment that over here, we're doing okay. And the reason why I have this slide up is because even in 2010, the government was appealing to a very pro-empire historian, Niall Ferguson, intelligent man, but very pro-empire. They asked him to rewrite the English curriculum for English schools. That tells me, rather than trying to open our history, the past decade has been defined by trying to redefine it and redefine what patriotism is to young children. And so I guess for many in Britain, this story kind of starts and finishes here. We had an empire, it was great, minus a few issues. Black people arrived, Ian Wright, Stormzy, Raheem Sterling, I guess now Marcus Rashford, the end. So Windrush, for example, holds no more weight in history than to serve as a linchpin in the folklores of British liberalism, a beacon of British tolerance and benevolence, the I have a Black friend of history. So hence over 100 years since the lynching of Charles Wootton, the story of Black British activism, the fight against human rights abuses, unemployment, police brutality, race riots, arson, attempted deportations, and racist immigration policies, all of which helped to build the very civil rights and human rights policy landscape that we today hold as evidence of our so-called British tolerance, never really made it in the history books. And so for over a century, Black history has been restricted to the sidelines of pop culture, to humorous race rows and discussions on street crime and gang culture, while the true contributions to British politics and society has simply vanished. So all of this has amounted to a country largely indifferent to the plight of Black Britons, and makes us unable to go beyond surface-level denunciations of racist rhetoric. Instead, we continue to understand racism in the binary and simplistic good people aren't racist and bad people are kind of way. We regard the extent of racism in the UK as an issue of a few bad apples, white men behaving badly, individuals who lack British decency, and not an indication of sweeping systemic and structural discrimination that has carried over from the colonial world in which we created. And so again, it makes Black Lives Matter in the UK seem so out of context, random and overblown. Many white people understand the pain of African Americans when George Floyd was murdered, because American history of racism and of civil rights is so fresh and overt and undeniable. It's depicted by dogs attacking people in the street and placards and burning churches. But the same people will struggle to understand that why Black Brits would be protesting so heavily here, you know, because we treat you guys okay. The other day, I stumbled upon an old documentary. It was Andrew Marr's Modern History of Britain. For those who don't know Andrew Marr, he's, I guess, a BBC commentator, journalist, presenter, talks a lot. I'm not a big enemy of him, but I watched his documentary and it made me think. So this Andrew Marr's Modern History of Britain was a 3-hour-long episodes, 3 episodes an hour long, which was built around the book that he'd just written. And it included Marr trotting up and down the country, retelling how Britain became who we are today. Around 5 minutes of that is afforded to race and multiculturalism in Britain, of course. Marr suggests that the leaders of the political parties were largely in favour of Windrush. Well, we know that they weren't. And that Caribbean men, and this is a quote, without the restraining influences of wives and sisters, created a sexually charged, bohemian and edgy atmosphere in London that was, again in Marr's words, a living insult to the white working class who were lacking housing opportunities. That, for Marr, is his justification for what he calls the first race riots in the UK in 1950s. Of course, I've clearly exemplified where race riots existed very early in the 1900s, and we can go even further back than that. So not only is it factually incorrect, it's riddled with all kinds of stereotypical and harmful types of understandings of Black community. Sexually charged, bohemian, edgy atmosphere. You know, he's talking about drugs and everything else. It's very interesting. And so this, according to Marr, is our contribution to modern Britain. We're sexually deviant foreigners who pissed off some poor white guys and took their jobs. It's a narrative that we continue to use today to criminalize, incarcerate, and deport Black people and to fuel anti-immigration hysteria. But Marr's history is a general British understanding. Black people are an addition to our story and not intrinsic to it. The contribution of Black war heroes, of the Windrush generation, to the sculpting of modern Britain, the development of our civil rights, is nothing more than a side note to explain white responses to it. White people could be bad, but Black people were kind of asking for it. And so this is why, in my opinion, if Black history is indeed British history, and if British history is a world history, it must be treated as pivotal to who we are as Shakespeare or Bowie. It's not to remove the story of colonialism or post-colonialism, but simply to fill in the blanks. I was going to play this clip, but I figured I'd describe it instead. And so, because I think it kind of exemplifies the point. I was watching back this clip of George the Poet, who I'm a big fan of, and he was having a conversation with Emily Maitlis, who I'm equally a big fan of. But in the conversation, it was during the Black Lives Matter movement, Emily asked George to give an account of what was happening in the US and what's happening in the UK. And so he does that very eloquently. He gives all the data and evidence and talks it all through. And then, as it feels like he's made some kind of headway, Emily then asks the question. She goes, "Oh, but you know, it's not as bad as over here, as over there. You know, they have guns." And you see the pain in George's face as he has to respond, as if we're to be thankful that at the very least we're not getting shot. You know, it's the same age-old British pat on the back trope that yes, we're racist, but we're not as racist as America, as if that's to assuage guilt. And that's why we need these stories. Because without them, the deficit in justice, the ethnic penalty of structural racism and inequality only deepen. The Black British story is one of overcoming racism and the myths of Blackness and not succumbing to it. Yet the justifications of upholding the colour bar in 1919 are almost the same as what policymakers today use to justify their approaches to policing black communities, that of Black criminality and of Black temperament, drill being a very recent example of that. This is the deficit in justice that so many people, why some people chose to march for Black Lives Matter. It wasn't just for the collective pain we felt for George Floyd, and the many others on both sides of the pond who continue to die by the hands of police brutality. But that here in the UK, while the very existence of racism is denied, and Black people are continuously dragged into arguments of culture wars and erasing history, our vulnerable young people are being used as political footballs, and the opportunities in life have been asphyxiated through every institution they must enter. So, I guess it's an intense talk in a way, but I don't want it to paint a wholly negative picture, because while the challenges are great and, you know, the issues that many within the Black community face today would draw very strong parallels to the issues they faced in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So we haven't progressed in many areas by the data. But I do think at this current, what happened in the summer, and my friends will tell you I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. So even if me saying this is a positive, but I do think that we are actually in a positive place. And so for the first time in a long time, the conversation's heading in a good direction. And I think that the allies of Black movements are deciding to move alongside us and understanding that if this movement is to be meaningful, they must provide the spaces like this for us to speak while not trying to speak for us. I think businesses and organizations that began their response to Black Lives Matter with very vacuous posts and hashtags and black squares, you know, we understand you, we hear you, are understanding and realizing now that without solid action on their words, that their allyship will be viewed as nothing more than hollow, vacuous virtue signaling, and they will be called on it. Of course, as statues topple and plans for new ones emerge, the Black story of the past century is beginning to come to light. Because, of course, to build a statue to honor Black history, we first need to know who our Black heroes are. And even on that, you know, the Mayor of London and the City Hall at the moment is currently running an inquiry into how Black history should appear in the public realm. So clearly there's an understanding that how we glorify and lionize our Black heroes should exist in the public spaces, and there's an investigation going into that, which is positive. There are campaigns to teach a more inclusive, more diverse history in our schools, beyond Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, still big up them too. Campaigns such as the Black curriculum or fill in the blanks, just to name two. Yet, the challenges are still great. The policy landscape, the police and our current government remain ill-equipped and willfully indifferent to the challenges of the Black community. We still talk about Black on Black crime. We still racialize gang violence. We still try to ban Black music. We still overly exclude Black children and force them into dangerous situations on the streets. The media still demonize immigrants, and we still haven't really carried out the actions in any report into structural racism since McPherson. That's decades now. So we're far from the equality of opportunity that vulnerable people, Black or otherwise, desperately need in order to achieve their potential. And so I just want to close quickly. I'm not sure how we're doing here on time, Anita, but I've just got a few last things to say. So when HMS Windrush arrived on Tilbury Dock in 1948, carrying with her some 500 passengers from across the Caribbean Sea, she came with a very simple dream, that the motherland of the Commonwealth, for whose prosperity they volunteered their lives and the lives of their fathers and grandfathers in war, will provide them with the opportunity to share in the spoils of victory. Yet what they were met with was the very British rendition of violence and vitriol that still so many protest today. Rejection from the wartime hero himself, Winston Churchill, who despised Blackness to a molecular level, wishing to run his 1952 election campaign on the slogan, "Keep Britain White." They will find themselves trapped between the white men in unions who refuse to hire them and the unions that refuse to protect them. Both political parties would research just how lazy and how criminal Black Caribbean men were and worried about how white men would receive them arriving in the UK of their uncontrollable sexuality. These young Black dream chasers found themselves in a new world where their Blackness was as dangerous in Notting Hill as it was in the fields. And in this new world, they found themselves marginalized, disenfranchised and ghettoized while carrying the insurmountable weight of expectation from back home. So for me, I believe we owe it to them to tell their stories respectfully and honestly, not to romanticize the Black experience, but to simply to include it, and importantly, to learn from it, so that never again can we tell the heroes of our country that they simply aren't British enough. That's me. Thank you very much. I think we might have some time for Q&A, I'm not sure. But just on my final few points, you can probably tell I like to talk a lot, I like to write too. So if you didn't completely hate what I wrote, what I said, my blog is there. You can follow me on my Medium blog. Also, if you have Twitter, I've got like 5 Twitter followers, so I would appreciate some Twitter love. Oliver H. Bishop is my handle. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to take part in this event.
Ooh.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for that, Oliver. Can you hear us here?
I can't hear you that well, man.
You can't hear me that well. Can you hear me now? I heard something.
That's slightly better, yes.
Slightly better, slightly better. Thank you so much for that. That was so informative and well put together. And you may not have heard this before, but you speak so well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you said I speak so well. I'm still struggling to hear you a little bit, but I'm going to tell myself that's what you said to give myself. Yeah. So thank you.
Wow, I'm just taking that all in because, as you pointed out, so many people are not really aware of any history outside of the US. Black history tends to mean history from the USA, not even Canada, so it's not even North America, it's the USA. What is it initially that made you do this, basically? I know you spoke about being in school, but what is it that drives you? I don't even mean the facts or the figures, but what is the thing? What is the thing?
So you asked me what drives me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, honestly, you know what it is, right? I think as I grew up, I kept seeing one narrative about who I'm supposed to be. But then in my everyday life, I saw something different. Like if you think about the narrative around young black men and young black boys, it's about crime, criminality, gang crime, drugs, violence, all of this stuff, right? Which is supposed to define us. Then when I go meet my friends, the first thing, if I see a guy I ain't seen in a long time, is, oh, how you doing, fam? The first thing he would say is, oh, I'm just trying to be like you, bro. I see you, Shan. Like, these were the interactions I had with people. And it always bothered me that, like, we're told to be one thing, but then we really are something else. And I just wanted to be able to share that story. So I just took the time, I guess, and started to learn. And the more I learned, the more I realized this large hole in our history and what it would mean to us as a community, but also to the country as a whole. I'll tell you that story about Len Johnson, the boxer. I didn't know that story until a friend of mine who was a white guy who told me that story. He taught me about black history because he saw what was happening and thought, I would like to know some more. And he was a boxer, so he's like, I've got to learn this stuff. And this to me is the power of what these stories do for us as a community and a society. And so the more I've spent time trying to learn and understand it, the more passionate I've become about understanding the power of history to be unifying for us in terms of building a national identity. At the moment, it's going in a complete opposite direction, right? These things we talk about, culture wars, and Lawrence Fox and Piers Morgan, they're hell-bent on building a narrative that is completely counter to what we should be. Like, we've got so many different stories that make us a great country, but instead we choose to focus on our division. So I thought that for me is what drove me. And I just, I can't sit on the sidelines forever, I think that's important.
Right. Yeah. Well, I just wanted to thank you for that passion, basically. Before we even open the Q&A, I just wanted to thank you so much for that passion.
So we have, Oliver, can you hear me?
I'm struggling to hear you guys.
Okay, I'll try to talk louder. Can you hear me now?
A little bit.
Oh, gosh. Okay, well, we have got some questions. We're going to read those out. But I've got a comment and a question. One is, when is A Lost History by Oliver Hypolite-Bishop going to be written? Yeah, I'd like to read your version. And the comment is that, you talked about so many things, and I'm going to watch this again so I can really absorb it all. But you talked about the Harold Moody and the black seaman. My dad, Wilson, Shervington, came here as a seaman, as a merchant seaman. So that really, that resonated for me and shows even more the alignment in inviting you to do this talk. And, a speaker like you is just the kind of person that I would have taken my dad to listen to. So, did you hear that? You don't need to comment back because we're going to start reading out the questions from the public now. So, Juice, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay. So this is from username 160500. That's really mysterious right there. It says, hi, Oliver. I love this talk. How would you describe British racism?
I would describe it, I think I described it earlier in the talk as riddled with truly incredible paradoxes, as in it's a complete, there's no handle on the conversation. I think we in the UK continue to understand a very individual type of racism. So, I mean, it's similar to what we see with anti-Semitism at the moment in Labour Party. We don't talk about the systemic challenge. We're trying to find individual cases and stories to understand it. And we talk about racism in terms of, for Black people, it's, okay, did anyone say the N-word? Did someone do this? Did someone do that? It's very individualistic because, and it removes itself from the institutional challenges that we face. And I think that is a very uniquely British challenge that we have, because while institutions systemically, racism is quite devastating to Black communities, we use Blackness as a way to argue how liberal Britain is. So our mere presence and the mere presence of our involvement in society is used as a way of understanding that, or way of explaining how great Britain is, you know, Britain's lovely, blah, blah. But realistically, there's a thing called the ethnic penalty, right, which sits on top of race. Actually, in answer to that question, so racism, and it's something that Carla argues so clearly, he says that racism essentially is just dressed up classism. So what it makes it different here in the UK to, I guess, other parts of the world is that we have a very rigid and devastating class structure in the UK. We are also incredibly unequal as a society, so the challenges exacerbate. But race and what has come to be called the ethnic penalty is what sits on top of the classism structure. So it's, you know, it's the unique identifier. You are of a working class. If you are of a working class and you are Black, the challenges you face are infinitely higher, and that's called the ethnic penalty. So an example of that is we know that we incarcerate more Black people as a proportion of the community than the US do. We know that we have higher mental health interventions in the Black community, higher rates of homelessness, higher higher school exclusion. So the kind of ways in which Black people are impacted by the class structure is unique to the UK. What also then happens is, because we have a certain way of understanding race and racism in a very unhelpful way. So we talk, you know, like I said, we talk about crime and, you know, Black pathologies, Black on Black crime, absent fathers, all these myths of Black criminality. These myths sit on top of the ethnic penalty and on top of class, that then introduce far more draconian, far more interventionist, punitive measures on the Black community, like stop and search, like school exclusions, like imprisonment, that would be viewed as wholly inappropriate if to focus on any other community. And that's what makes it quite unique in the UK, is that we somehow found a way within policy, within our institutions, to justify these very unequal, discriminatory practices in criminal justice as if it's somehow helpful for all of us, you know. And I think that, if that makes sense, that's what I see as being different to us. We use the structures of class and race to understand why Black people were supposedly involved in certain issues, and then the way that we intervene in that community is very different to how we intervene with most communities. Examples like banning Black music, like drill music, or excluding kids unfairly. So these kind of issues, I think, is unique to the UK in that particular perspective. But again, I think, you know, with the US and the UK, we kind of draw power, we draw influence from each other in the worst, and I don't know about the best way, but definitely in the worst ways. In the 80s, it was neoliberalism that kind of drove that heightened inequality, both in the US and the UK. The wars on drugs that came about from the US inspired the wars on drugs that we have in the UK now. Neither of them have really been beneficial to the Black community, be it been devastating, but we kind of work in tandem. So nothing is unique, but the UK has a very specific way of understanding race and class.
Well, Oliver, I hope you can hear me. We have about 5 minutes left. There's a question from Mike from Birmingham, who asks, who was the seaman that you mentioned? You mentioned a black seaman, and he wants to... Who was that?
Oh, I can't hear you. Say that one more time, sorry.
Okay, maybe Mike from Birmingham will need to watch the replay to catch the name of the black seaman that you mentioned.
The name of the...
Seaman. Sailor.
Oh, Charles Wootton. Oh, Charles Wootton.
Charles
Wootton, W-O-O-T-T-O-N, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, Charles Wootton. That was in 1919. So what happened was that during those particular riots, there were riots in the US in the same year as well, at the same time in Chicago. So during those riots in Liverpool, he was forced onto the pier, onto the dock, forced into the water, and then a mob of white rioters threw stones at him until he died. So they stoned him to death until he fell into the water and passed. So that was quite a tragic way, quite a difficult way for him to die. So they do remember him in Liverpool. After there is, I think he has a plaque, and they do each year trying to remember his memory and his legacy and what that meant. But I think the reason why I talk about Charles Wootton specifically, because he's not the only person to have died in such a tragic way here, but it marks, I guess, a century of this particular struggle and this particular level of activism. So I like to map it from the 1919 to 29, 2020, where we are at the moment, and we can see 100 years of consistently through that period of very, very similar, devastating circumstances.
Indeed. This one here from Charlene. She says, "Hi, Oliver. How did you find out about Dr. Harold Moody? And what could I do to find out about these black heroes that we don't know?"
What can you do to find out about these black heroes?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'll tell you what. Can you still see my slides?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Look at that. It's kind of worked out. There's no one that knows more about black history, black British history, than the very incredible David Olusoga. And so if you want to find out more about black history in its entirety, I would say absolutely grab that book that's there on the far left called Black and British. And he actually maps out very early black British civilizations, because his task was to basically explore why this history why it doesn't really exist in our current politics, in our current narratives, but also just how prevalent black British communities have been in the UK for so long. So we can map it back to, the Roman era. Yeah. And also we can look at Black Georgians, Edwardians, Victorians. Have always been quite prominent black communities, and he goes into that in great detail. So I would recommend giving that a read. Also, if you want to find out more black British history, follow me on Twitter. Okay. But I think that it's a difficult, it's not so easy to find these stories, but it's becoming increasingly more easy. One thing I've noticed during this particular month is some organizations have even Sky, for example, have taken on a mission to talk about black history in more depth. And that has been quite nice to see. So I think over time, we're going to start to see more. But there are campaigns, like I said, like Fill in the Blanks, or the Black Curriculum, that can teach you a bit more. But also I would definitely recommend reading David Olusoga's book. I think it's brilliant.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and we want quick answers for these. Do you want to read out Charlene's?
Charlene, we just did Charlene.
Oh, we did. Okay. So we now have Amanda from Canada. All right. So she says, outside of London, where in the UK would you say has the biggest pro-black / anti-black racism movement? And I also WhatsApp that question to you.
Quick.
So you sent me some questions here.
Yeah.
I don't want to ignore anybody. So I've answered the one about Seaman. How can I find about Dr. Moody? Where in the UK would you say has the biggest pro-black anti-racist movement?
Yeah.
So answer that question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, to be honest with you, I think across most cities, most multicultural cities, there's been a strong anti-racist movement. I have to give a shout out to Bristol always, because Bristol has always had a strong black community built off a difficult history given its location and its involvement in the trade. But I think, yeah, Bristol, absolutely. Shout out Bristol, but also Birmingham, Nottingham, Manchester, absolutely. There's actually a street called Smethwick Street, which I was talking about the other day. And in Smethwick is where actually Malcolm X came one time, because they used to call it the most racist street in the UK. And within that street, they petitioned the local government, the white community petitioned the local government to not allow any black people to live on that street. And it was upheld until one individual sent a message to Malcolm X. And he said, look, can you come and help out and give a couple of talks? So Malcolm X came down to Smethwick in the West Mids and he gave a talk, and eventually things started to change. So I think all over the UK we see quite prominent movements as long as there's willing in the community. I see another question as well, if I may, about contemporary challenges that we face. And honestly, I don't think the challenges have changed drastically. That's the problem, is that we're still talking about the same things. For me, I think what the Black Lives Matter movement itself has struggled, not themselves or what hasn't really, so we know through Black Lives Matter, right, and through what happened in the summer, the kind of conversations that have been moved forward is about history, you know, statues and Churchill and a lot of that kind of conversation. But what hasn't, and is present, you know, black people's visibility in the media and movies and music, what hasn't really moved forward is, this is just my opinion, is the transition away from the myths of black criminality, those of black on black crime, or again, lone parents, single parent households, all that kind of stuff, which are what lead to those very punitive, disproportionate criminal justice policies, these myths. Black on black crime gave us Operation Trident, and a whole force of the police focused only on black crime. There's no such thing called black on black crime. I could actually tell you a story, you know, so I wrote an article during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, about what I felt at the time was a very vacuous support behind the movement. It was the people using the black square as I have a black friend of social media, you know. And within all of that, I started to get messages from people saying, oh, you know, like, I understand what you're saying, but surely, like, shouldn't black people also, you know, handle their own issues within their own community? And shouldn't Black Lives Matter be making sure that black people internally handle their own problems? It's like, what problems are you talking about there, mate? Of course, black on black crime, of course. And it always bothered me. But I got one of those comments from a friend of mine, you know, and that friend of mine, he and I both grew up in Camden. And I told you that story about me when I was young. We both grew up in Camden. Camden, for those that don't know, is incredibly multicultural. It's very unequal, because we have, on one side you have Primrose Hill, where like Harry Styles and Kate Moss live. On the other side you have Queen's Crescent Estate, which is one of the poorest housing estates in the country, in the city, sorry. And so it's very diverse, also equally ethnically diverse. So all the gangs and all the trouble that happened in Camden was also, of course, equally ethnically diverse. But in his understanding of black on black crime, and not to mention, this kid was doing the same nonsense I was doing as a kid. He had managed to remove all the English, Greek, Armenian, Polish, Turkish, Somali, every ethnicity. He removed them, and it was just black boys and black crime. So to me, that told me that these myths are just perpetuated by a wider understanding that is so counterintuitive, so illogical, it's hard to argue. Because we know, for example, in places like Glasgow that had high levels of knife crime, just like in London, they used public health approaches to tackle the problem, and numbers started to go down. They didn't use arguments such as, oh, well, you know, this is a white on white problem, so we have to stop these white kids killing each other, or this is Glaswegian problem, and it's clearly a problem with Glaswegian boys around the country, so we have to tackle it, because that would sound crazy. But when we say it with black people, we don't add any kind of measures to it. We don't talk about black, young, vulnerable, typically men, or typically boys, sorry, involved in crime. Instead, we use a general sweeping term of all black boys doing crime. And that is particularly harmful, because it's damaging young boys' and sometimes girls, their life chances, and also their own understanding of themselves. Because when you treat people in such a way, like what Stop and Search does to people's self-esteem, their self-belief in themselves, it's destructive. In London, for example, we know that both white men and white boys are proportionally more likely to be victims and perpetrators of crime. That's not to say that black people aren't overrepresented in the statistics. They are, very much so. But in London, it's about 17% of the young population is of a black background. Of that 17%, less than 1% are involved in serious youth violence. So that means, that's a stat you'll never hear, but that means that for most black people in cities like London, whether you're rich, poor, old or young, you don't have any kind of relationship with crime other than to see other young, vulnerable, working class black boys go through it. And if we use public health approaches to tackle those problems, we'd see a solution. Instead, we use criminal justice solutions like the data that just came out recently. We're stopping 500,000 black kids and we're not even arresting 1% of them. You know, it's a complete mess. And so until we tackle those myths of black criminality, we can't really move forward. So that's how I answer that question.
Okay.
Let me see, what's the next question? Yeah, so my thoughts, thank you, Percy. My thoughts on Black history in schools, I think it's vital that we are able to find a way to embed Black history into our education system, absolutely. And I think that we're actually moving in a complete wrong direction at the moment. I'll talk about it in a second. But more importantly than teaching Black history is about who teaches that history. And my worry is, because teachers can actually right now teach Black history. There's nothing stopping them doing it. The challenge is that it's not a part of our national curriculum. Okay, it's not part of the history curriculum. Okay, but you can teach the history if you feel equipped. Most teachers don't feel equipped to do so. That's my understanding. I could be wrong. But beyond that, we need more diverse teaching. We need teachers that come from these communities and can teach the history. We need people that spend their time learning this and also teaching it. And just beyond our curriculum, we need wider society to also take on this history, because it's one thing going to school and learning it, but then going into the real world and then seeing something completely different. I think we need to understand that it's more than just teaching, it's how you embed it. But then I also think we have a big issue in the UK with our understanding of what it is to be patriotic. And so I was given that example earlier of Niall Ferguson being involved in building our history curriculum because he's a historian, but he's pro-empire, because to be proud of empire is to be, patriotic. You love your country. And if you criticize the country in any way, you criticize Churchill, you criticize anything, you are unpatriotic. It's very unhelpful to have that kind of dialogue. And that's what has led to our, our culture war type stuff, where they tell you, oh, if you hate it here so much, why don't you just bloody go back to where you came from? That's not a conversation. We see it happening. Tony Blair said he wouldn't apologize for empire, as did conservative MPs. This is not just about any kind of political faction. This is going across the board about what we regard to be makes you a patriot, makes you unpatriotic. David Lammy MP actually has some really good commentary on this about what it means to be a progressive patriot, which is how do you push your country forward through patriotism and not hold it back. So yeah, I think there's a much bigger conversation to be had around that, but absolutely vital that we get Black history or elements of our Black history into our curriculum.
Yeah. Oliver, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We need to wrap up now, but we do have more questions that came in, and I hope that you can follow up some of these conversations via Twitter and the way you do social media. And I hope that we can follow up with you as well, because there's a number of things that you talked about that, there's many episodes there, I think, to carry on the conversation, especially you touched on girls a little bit there. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to let you go now, and we're going to go back to the band who are going to play you out. I did tell them the track that you asked for, your Miles Davis track. And yeah, so they're going to play us out. And what I would say to everybody watching is stay tuned, listen to the band, talk to Oliver on Twitter if you can, and stay tuned for our next piece, which, as you know, we have an hour delay today. So we're actually going to start our Sound as a Weapon segment at 7 o'clock.